blah, blah, blah for 30 years by politicians. Greta Thunberg had it right about the Taoiseach at the UN Security Council, at much of the debate that has happened today. The gulf between the promises, the rhetoric, the talk, and the reality of the action, or lack of action, just grows wider and wider. So the Taoiseach was right at the UN Security Council when he said that climate change is the defining challenge of our generation, and that the Council must do more in the issue of climate and security. He didn't mention, of course, the fact that sitting in the room with him there is representatives basically of the US military, which is the biggest polluter in the world, the biggest contributor to climate catastrophe and the biodiversity crises that we face. But the same, I was listening earlier to Minister Smith, who I didn't catch all of it, but he was making the point that, you know, we used to all use GDP, and now even CSO has gone GDP. We're no longer relying on GDP. And just the gulf between that talk and the reality of the government's action around data centres. The reason that the actual arguments that are used by the government about why we have to proceed with data centres, despite the fact that it is an absolute contradiction with even meeting the government's inadequate targets in terms of climate change, 51% by 2030, is precisely because of the argument around GDP. The government is absolutely committed to that. So it's complete and rank hypocrisy. A climate emergency suggests an emergency response. If your house is on fire, you call the fire brigade, you don't pour more petrol on the flames. And that's what the government is doing with driving ahead with the construction of additional data centres on top of what we already have here, and the building of further fossil fuel infrastructure, of LNG terminals. It's completely at odds with the commitments that the state has made under the Paris Agreement. It's completely at odds with the government's own promises. It's completely at odds with what was said today, with what the Taoiseach said at the UN. It would consign all of the targets to the bin, but nonetheless, that's what is being pushed ahead with. I do want to emphasise the importance of, we've had a lot of focus on the aspect of our bill which would ban data centres. But the other very important part of our bill, which will be debated later on today, is to ban investment in further fossil fuel infrastructure. It makes no sense to sink further money into fossil fuel infrastructure that will be with us for decades and decades into the future. The more and more money that is invested in fossil fuel infrastructure, the more that the vested interest, the capitalist class have, the more they're going to say, well, we have to stick with this because we haven't got our money back from the investment. It makes no sense to have any energy investment taking place in fossil fuels that we have to rapidly move away from. All investment in energy should be going into energy solutions rather than creating more energy problems. And yet the government is also going to oppose that aspect. There's been an amount of commentary generally about the IPCC report, which is very stark in its conclusions and in the speed and scale of the disaster that we are facing. But something that was a bit less commented upon was the leaked second draft of the IPCC report on mitigation strategies. And it states that we must move away from the current capitalist model to avoid surpassing planetary boundaries and climate and ecological catastrophe. That's scientists, not socialists. It's scientists who are looking at the reality that capitalism is driving us towards disaster. Deputy Barry makes the correct point that they could be scientists who are also socialists. And indeed, I would suspect that many climate scientists who are looking with open eyes at what is happening are drawing the conclusion that a system that treats nature as free, that bases itself on the exploitation of labour and of nature and treats damage to nature, both in terms of biodiversity crisis and climate crisis as an externality, something they don't have to care about, is incompatible with the kind of change that we need and time frame that we need to have it to avoid absolute disaster. Just want to finish by reference to what would a proper climate action plan look like. It would start with that recognition that capitalism is the problem. We have to move we have to break radically from a system which prioritises profit and the growth of a certain sort that goes with that, that doesn't add to people's quality of life. I think, and then it would be a programme like an eco-socialist Green New Deal to transform people's lives for the better, not to make people's lives harder, to make people's lives easier and better, while also having a rapid transition to a zero-carbon economy in developed economies like Ireland by 2030. What that would mean is that instead of investing in more motorways, we would invest in free, green and frequent public transport. People do not want to be sitting in cars in gridlock for hours every day. People would jump at the opportunity to be in quality, decent, free public transport on a daily basis, and it would dramatically cut emissions. It would mean investing in a green jobs programme, retrofitting every building across the state, rewilding, rewetting our bogs, afforestation, renewable energy, but also care jobs, in building a national health service, building a national childcare service, improving our education service dramatically. It would mean moving to a sustainable model of agriculture. The truth is, our model of agriculture is built around the interests of big agribusiness, and it drives a model that is based on intensive production of beef and dairy. Instead, we need an approach that is based on the principles of food sovereignty. We need diversification, and we need to incentivise farmers to farm sustainably. We need to guarantee them an income, and we need to ensure that they're paid for the carbon sequestration activities that they are engaged in. It would mean a 4-day week without loss of pay, which frees up time for people, improves the quality of people's lives dramatically, and would reduce carbon usage. And finally, it would mean taking the key sectors of the economy out of the hands of the private corporations who run them for profit, run the whole economy for profit, and don't care about what happens to our environment, and instead planning them in the interests of people and our planet.